Why should this have happened specifically in modern culture? Isn't it part of the human condition as such?
It is part in the sense that man is a being who flies away from truth even as he pursues it. But I think one of the reasons it happens specifically in modern culture is, of course, we build up a much more intricate technical society. We're more encased in the sheer human framework of things than people were at one time.
Simply because we live in a much more complex, complicated
Right. We live in an air-conditioned nightmare, to borrow the term of Henry Miller. But we live more and more in a man-created environment, if we consider it all down the line, from our air conditioning to everything else. And our urban complexes, I mean, I can't help but think, coming to London, that London is a very different city from Shakespeare's London, which existed that much closer to the countryside. You could probably, you know, very shortly walk out. And so on.
Well, what are the main themes, then, of the later Heidegger, as distinct from the earlier?
Yes, well, you see, the later Heidegger is not systematic, or not even systematic in the way in which he attempts to be in Being and Time. The later Heidegger is primarily, or not primarily, but very centrally concerned with the problem of poetry and art. And in some sense, you see, and the problem of technology. Heidegger feels that, or felt, since he's dead now, one of the tasks of philosophers in this period is to try to think through what technology involves. He felt that, I think, modern thinking is either too superficial, too inauthentic with regard to the subject of technology. You know, on one hand, you find people very flippant attitude, they're against machines, or they're for technology. It makes no sense, he said, for man at this particular juncture of history to be for or against technology. We're obviously committed to technology. I mean, if you removed it, the whole thing would collapse. We are. That's part of the stake of our existence. It's part of our gamble. On the other hand, you see, there is a point which I think the atomic bomb has brought forth for human consciousness generally, that technology has drastic possibilities. Hitherto, people have protested against it as local nuisances or causing unemployment, sabotage, and so on. But the notion that suddenly mankind could self-destruct suddenly showed us the fearful possibilities within the technical complex. And now Heidegger was concerned with thinking through where in the historical destiny of man the roots of his technical being lie, and where it may possibly be carrying him, you see.
But how does his concern with poetry relate to his concern with technology? Unless he sees these as two opposite sides of the same kind.
They are opposite. Because the thing, well, as you well know from other branches of contemporary philosophy, there's a certain disposition on the part of some philosophers when they're examining language to treat it as a calculus. It's an instrument which can be manipulated and controlled. It's a formal calculus and so on. And in this sense, this represents an extension of technical thinking, you see, even to the domain of language. Now, the thing about a poem in Heidegger's view is that it eludes the demands of our will. The poet cannot will to write a poem. He cannot will it. It comes. And actually, we as his readers can't will our response. We have to submit to it and be passive to it. You see, what Heidegger connects the technological scent of this civilization is with its Faustian will, which becomes eventually the Nietzschean will.
Which goes right back again to man's determination to master nature, which is the basis of our whole modern culture, modern technology, modern science, and so on, which he is in rebellion against.
And I think the key quotation here would be Francis Bacon. We must learn, who is really a prophet of the new science in this respect. I always think of Bacon in this respect as being a publicity man for the new science, but a publicity man of genius. He says, we must put nature to the rack to compel it to answer our questions, which is a very dramatic way of endorsing the experimental method. But now you stop to think, you know, even if we put poor nature to the rack, poor tortured nature, we have to listen to her responses. We have, in some sense, to give ourselves to be receptive. There's a point at which our twisting you see, has to submit to whatever is there to be.
This really does represent a basic break with the tradition, doesn't it? Because even, as it were, revolutionary philosophies within the tradition, like Marxism, for example, take it for granted that the conquest of nature is man's business. It's what human life is all about and what social life is all about. I must say that, speaking just purely personally for a moment, that in all the preparation that this television series has involved me in, the preparation I've done for this discussion and this program has taught me most, because I've found in Heidegger, who I knew very little about before, all kinds of illuminating insights in these very fundamental themes we've been discussing. And that being so, this is leading me to the point I want to put to you. I can't help wondering why it is that other philosophers, including very able and prestigious ones like A.J. Ayer or Karl Popper or Rudolf Carnap, all sorts of people, pour scorn on Heidegger and the kind of philosophy that he's trying to do. They dismiss it, they've dismissed it in their published writings as nonsense, rubbish, garbage, it's all a lot of rhetoric, it's all a lot of words. It seems to me you've only got to read the stuff for 5 minutes to see that it isn't just all a lot of words. Now, why has it been so derisively dismissed by so many such able people?
Well, I don't want to make an invidious remark about philosophy and the state of philosophy, but there is a certain kind of professional deformation. A man has a certain vision, and he carries with this sort of blinders to somebody else's vision. I think one of the things is that Heidegger's vocabulary, you see, is initially rather jarring. And but I think if you read him in German, he writes a fairly straightforward German, and certainly if you compare him as his German prose with that, let's say, of Hegel, it seems to me Heidegger's lucidity itself. But I think what we do find in philosophy is that there's a certain prejudice for certain chosen vocabularies. Now, you mentioned Carnap. I was a student of Carnap for several years, you say, and I got interested partly in Heidegger to find out what the fuss was. Could he be as bad as they said?
What, you came to Heidegger through Carnap's attacks on Heidegger?
Right.
Yes, yes.
And,
yes. And when you read Heidegger, you discovered that he wasn't as bad as they said. Yes, yes. But Professor Barrett, when I was introducing this program, I promised our viewers that we would say something about Sartre. And I think that before we come to an end, I really do want to ask you if we can move on to him just for a moment. Although Sartre has become, as it were, the most famous existentialist, his is the name that most people associate with existentialism, he's not as original a thinker as Heidegger, is he? But nevertheless, he has made a contribution. What would you characterize as being Sartre's main contribution?
Well, there are a number of ways which you can characterize that, but I'd like to contrast them first. Perhaps that might point the direction which his contribution has come. You see, Sartre's big book, his major philosophical work, and I personally think, by the way, some of his novels and plays are more important than any of his philosophical writing, but I think he's still a philosopher of considerable brilliance. But his major work is called Being and Nothingness. It's a gigantic misnomer. It's not about being, and it's not about nothingness. Sartre doesn't have much of a feeling for being. Whatever one may object to in Heidegger, one has to acknowledge that man is really saturated with the sense of being in some sense. What Sartre's book is about is really the kind of melodrama of two Cartesian consciousnesses. And naturally they're Cartesian because he's French. Every Frenchman is a Cartesian, I think, when he's pushed far enough. And these two consciousnesses never understand each other. That is, there are two subjectivistic minds who misinterpret each other. I, as subject, impose upon you and convert you into an object and so on, and you reciprocate. And so this fiendish dialogue of misrepresentation goes on, and misunderstanding and so forth. In the end, it becomes impossible for us to communicate sincerely. This big book of Sartre is really a book on the problem of sincerity, which is the staple, I think, of French literature from Montaigne, right through Molière and Proust and so on. Now, but to come to, you see, Sartre's then most famous positive doctrine is its notion of liberty, and it's the doctrine which actually, I think, caught on most in the public eye. That as human beings, we have an absolute and total freedom. Nothing prevents us at a certain moment from doing some very precipitous and dangerous thing.
I am in the literal sense free now to take all my clothes off or
Right.
go and jump out of the window,
Right.
or I can actually
Yes,
do these
yes,
things.
yes.
And one thing Sartre keeps stressing is that by pretending that I am not free to do them, I'm falsifying the reality
Right.
of my own situation.
Yes. So I stand on a precipice at any moment, and I can hurl myself off it. And in this sense, the characteristic of this total freedom is that it's vertiginous or dizzying. And he carries through this metaphor of standing on a cliff and having this dizzy sense of being able to cast
But
yourself
isn't
down.
he
Nothing
right?
prevents you.
Isn't he right to dramatize in this way the fact that the realities of choice which we have in
Yes.
life and the realities
Yes.
of freedom that we have in life are in fact much greater than we ourselves wish to
Yes.
face for most of the time?
Except now, here's where you see, I think Heidegger has an insight which is beyond him in this respect, because the individual who hurls himself into this precipitous choice may, in tearing off in that sudden direction, remain utterly as blind as when he started. You see, now, it's rather curious that Heidegger's view of freedom is a very quiet one and subtle and soft. Our fundamental freedom is the freedom, if we can manage it, to become open, to let truth happen. And most of us in our lives are shut off in our personal lives in one way or another, doesn't matter which, from truth in our dealings with other people. We have resistances which can't be breached and so on. But sometimes there is a fissure in this wall that shuts us off, and we are able to let be. We no longer seek to compel. You see, the whole of the later Heidegger is really a prolonged attack on the will to power as characterizing Western
An
civilization.
attack on this urge we have to dominate nature,
Right. And even,
dominate our environment.
and even dominate our own personal lives or dominate
Yes.
other people.
The view being that you only really understand reality when in some sense you submit yourself to
Right.
it. Summing up, Professor Barrett, taking Heidegger and Sartre, and indeed the whole existentialist tradition together, if you were asked to say, well, now, what contribution has this made to human thought in our time, what would you stress? What have we got from it all?
I'll stress an academic point first, and then the more important human point following. I think from the point of view of the history of thought or the history of philosophy, existentialism has brought forward a kind of re-evaluation of 19th century thought. For one thing, it has exhumed Kierkegaard, who was virtually unknown in English-speaking countries. It's established him as a major thinker. I don't know whether you'd call him a philosopher, but a thinker of considerable proportions and power in the 19th. One of the major figures of the century. As a matter of fact, Wittgenstein said of Kierkegaard, he thought he was the greatest writer of the 19th century, which is rather interesting. Wittgenstein had discovered Kierkegaard quite early, before existentialism, toward the end of the World War I. But the second point, I think, that's made people aware of the fact that modern society tends to depersonalize to a certain extent, that it gets larger and larger, more intricately organized and so on. And that the problem of the person, the individual, as a unique being who cannot be completely assimilated into any framework, whether it's bureaucratic or conceptual or systematic, something of him is left out. I think this kind of emphasis is what it has brought forward, I think, most powerfully.
Thank you very much, Professor Barrett.